afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure and honor to receive this afternoon Sanjeev Vidyarthi. Thank you very much, Sanjeev, to be here today for a presentation entitled From the Local to Regional, Who is Planning Urban India and How? Sanjeev Vidyarthi is an associate professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Trained as an architect, urban designer, and spatial planner, Sanjeev studies ideas and action in the domain of human settlement, focusing upon the meanings and purposes of planning for places. His research interests span the field of planning theory and history, globalization and development studies, and his current research explores who does and should do the planning work. So thank you very much, Sanjeev, and I think you will further more on also your background. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Can you hear me fine? Yeah? All right. So as Christine said, this is, I sort of study sort of my overall research trajectory sort of tracks how did spatial planning thought and practice developed in the post-independence period. And within that, I sort of pay attention to using an interdisciplinary perspective. Though I trained initially as an architect and consulted many years, for more than 12 years as a professional consultant, my practice was mostly architecture based at Jaipur, but I sort of also did planning work, which many architects in India tend to do. But I do not nowadays see myself as an architect primarily. I think of myself as a planner, so as in the US folks would say, I'm a planning guy and a spatial planning guy. So I sort of, but try use an interdisciplinary perspective. So I read historians, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, and sort of look at scholarship on contemporary urban India when I sort of track the development of planning practice and thought in the post-independence period. What is planning? And this is important for me to sort of, in my own head, to orient my work and to use as a compass, both a moral compass and also as a professional compass to sort of think of what planning is. And I think of planning broadly as a human endeavor in which we try to sort of think of all around development of the many walks in human life. That's what planning means. And I'll speak a little bit more about how the conceptualization of planning within the academy, and I primarily refer to American Planning Academy here, has evolved, and what we think of planning now, what it means, and why we should be planning. So with that quick overview, let's move on to talk. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to try to do in next 30-40 minutes. First, I want to begin off by acknowledging the people who made this talk possible. Partho sort of played a very important role. Assiduously, he kept on tracking where I was and what I was doing. I was on a sabbatical for the past year, for the record, and happily lost, trying to do a few more productive things. So Partho has sort of also seen an earlier version of before I started embarking on the field work. And Mukta for making this possible, and for Christine to organize this talk, and folks here at CPR for hosting the event, and all of you for showing up, not on a very wonderful afternoon, perhaps this is, but nonetheless taking the trouble to come and listen to about my research. The talk is framed by two backstories. And I think we'll give it a minute. Yeah, a couple minutes for folks to settle down. So there are two backstories to my talk. One is the backstory of ongoing change in India. Most of you would be familiar with this, but nonetheless, I want to quickly sketch out a broad sort of perspective of what kind of changes are going on in order to make sense of kind of plans that are being made. The backstory too is changing perceptions of plan in literature. This is a story I imagine many of you might not be familiar with. But the perception of spatial plans within the planning discipline is sort of undergoing change. And I sort of briefly would sketch out how planners and especially planning scholars think of planning now. And then we would sort of move on to the case, which is national capital region. And this is where I'm sort of looking at what kind of spatial plans are being pursued and conceived and implemented. And then I'll try summarize. I've been allotted 45 minutes, but I'll try keep it under 40 minutes. And if I can, I'll be proud myself if I can do it under 35 minutes. But we'll see how that goes. So, story of ongoing changes in India. Sort of, we know the Nehruvian planning model of centralized planning based on sort of master planning at the level of cities and national level plans, mostly in the domain of economic planning, but they also had a substantial spatial connotation, sort of begins to change from 1990s. I think the following two charts sort of quickly summarize it. So this tracks the decadal growth rate of GDP, which sort of begins to pick up after the adoption of growth-oriented policies from 1990s, and you sort of see reflected here. Now, this is also translated in savings, both at the household level and the national level. What it essentially means is there is growing prosperity in this country since 1990s. That's the bigger, the largest frame we can think of. In the last 20 years, in this country, we have had a growing, whether that prosperity is evenly distributed, where it goes is a different question altogether. But nonetheless, there is a bigger economic change going on. What that has done is also fed social and political changes. There's an emergence of new social actors, social formations, while the older political patronage policies have also sort of led to social changes in the country, right? So there are social changes as well. At the political level, we know there is a ever-growing and pretty wide political support for growth-led politics, from the Hindu nationalists at the one end of the spectrum to the leftist on the other side, right? So there seems to be a near consensus on the idea that economic growth and growth-oriented policies, adoption of them is good for the nation. Now, what does it mean for the spatial stuff? The shift from the Nehruvian planning model, the economic side of it, that and Shivaramakrishnan right here at CPR sort of did incredible work showing that place-based development is becoming a focus area. So we are now not saying that we'll do only sectoral planning, but we are looking at places and place-oriented development, which encourages both private enterprise and it leverages public investment to sort of facilitate that place-based development. There's growing recognition of urban places as engines of economic growth. A growing pie of the national growth sort of comes from urban areas, and people sort of see, decision makers see urban areas as important, which sort of enables that shift or facilitates this shift to city-centric strategies. And here is a twist to this story. And Partha Chatterjee sort of talks about it a few years ago, where he says even if this economic growth sort of justifies further liberalization and policy reform, there is a sense in this country that we need to provide a culturally determined sense of what is minimally necessary for a decent life, which means that the state, on the same flip side of the coin, adopts liberal policies, facilitates rural development, housing for all, education for all, national urban and rural health missions, and so on and so forth. So it's classical liberal policy at some level, where we have growing policy support for capital-oriented development based out of urban areas, but also sort of focus on the rural and the disempowered sections of the society. Now, as planners, we sort of are aware of that these changes are usually intertwined with the geography of places and people. Here I want to put it on a bigger perspective. At the global level, we know that we live in one of the most dense areas of the world. This is a map that tracks human density across the world, right? So India has never been an easy case to understand and appreciate. And we sort of we live here and we sort of see it. This is one of the densest places. The lighter color shows less number of people at the global scale, and the darker color shows more people. Within the national boundaries, we know where we are, NCR right here, that this is the densest part within already very dense country, right? So this is, Muhammad Qadir sort of talked about in 80s, where he claimed that from Calcutta to Lahore, we have one continuous urban region, right? So this is the context where we sort of see those social, political, and economic changes playing out. So it's a very dynamic situation. And any claim a scholar tries to make is immediately contested by their colleagues. And that's why I think Indian urban scholarship is so very interesting at this point in time. Now, within that region, we know cities are distributed. And this is, all these maps are from 2001, right? This one here, this is 2005, and this is again 2001. So you can imagine 2011. And this shows only the settlements, which is more than 50,000 people. In the United States, where I live and study, anything over 500 would be counted as a city. In most European countries, 5,000 people would be a town. And here it's only 50,000, so you can imagine. And NCR, when we are looking at it, is a constellation of different settlements. Some of them classified as urban, some less urban, and some mofussil, and so on and so forth, right? And it does not even emphasize the boundary of states, where interstate regional coordination is a different ballgame altogether. So that sort of puts the broad canvas against which these economic, social, and political changes are taking place. Now, this is an interesting chart which sort of shows urban density along x-axis and quality of life ranking on the y. And there's little wonder that largest Indian cities are not only the densest places in the world, but also have some of the poorest quality of city life, right? So that's the dynamic where all of this comes together. So that was one backstory, which I want you to keep in mind when I talk about plans. The second backstory, which is closer to my heart, and that's what I do for a day job, is the changing perception of plans within the planning academy. Planners historically thought about planning as a technical, expert-oriented activity. In the post-war period, this sort of began to change in 1970s. As the critique of modernism sort of began to arise. Jane Jacobs is a classical example of, her scholarship is a classical example of this shift, and planners within the academy sort of began to wonder, what does planning mean? Why do we plan, and why, and how do we plan is important to understand. There is a shift away from sort of parochial perception of plans only as technical documents and as instruments of governance. When we think of planning, we think of essentially planning as a state-centered enterprise, that it's the state that does planning, and planning is part of governance. But that's not so true, because people also make plans. Even the most leftist, committed scholars make plans for retirement, make plans for tourism, make plans for different purposes, right? So planning in this view is a hardwired human activity. Everyone makes plans. You guys made plans to show up here. These plans might not be documented. They might not be formal. You might not be writing them down. We know, but plans are contingent and provisional. So that's a shift away from planning purely as a technical and governance exercise. The second is a move back towards the planning progressive roots. Remember, planning as a discipline, modern planning, sort of comes out of the industrialization period. So planning and public health and social work are three disciplines that grew out of the womb of the industrial city. So Chicago and London and New York in 1880s were some of the densest and the dirtiest and the hardest places to live in. New Delhi is a nice trailer compared to that grim urban reality. It sort of took place against the specter of early capitalism. So planners sort of go back to those progressive roots of the profession and begin to say, this planning is essentially about people and improving the quality of life. So that's a second shift that begins to take place from 1990s. People like Charlie Hoch make a distinction between big P plans and small p plans. Big P plans are plans made by capitalists, they're clever consultants made by states. जो हम लोग समझते हैं that these are plans, right? Master plans, regional plans, big P plans. And then there are small p plans, which many different social actors and individuals make. And they are as important. And the idea of participatory planning or equity planning sort of seeks to bring together those plans in the mainstream. And the idea is that more plans that join in improving the quality of city life, the better it is. Now, this is another important distinction which sort of planning scholars pay attention to. That plans are, the current definition of plans that I like really very much is that planning is a future-oriented exercise. It's a future-oriented exercise in which people and actors try to anticipate and adapt to an uncertain future. Let's go over it again. Future-oriented exercise. We do not know what tomorrow would bring. Neither here, nor if we are in an organization, nor if we are in an institution. The future remains uncertain. And we're trying to anticipate that it might turn out either in X way, so that's one scenario, or Y or Z, right? There might be plausible scenarios. And we're trying to anticipate what might happen, and we're trying to adapt to what changes might happen. That's sort of how planners conceive of plans and spatial planning as of now. It's not technical. Everyone, as I said, makes plans, right? So you are trying, when you're trying to make a plan to come here, you say, if I do not get this train connection, I might take a bus. Or if it does not happen, and this happens on the fly because it's so hardwired in the human mind. So they help us anticipate and adapt, not define and control. That's where master plans run into problems. Because we are trying to anticipate what might happen 20 years from now, and we are writing it down, right, as the law of the land. 20 years is too much. I mean, you do not even know what happens a week later or a couple fortnights later, right? So that's the kind of traction this view of planning begins to take. Controlling, using plans for governance has not worked anywhere. The city where I live in, Chicago, is one of the leaders in early planning efforts. 1908 Chicago Burnham Plan, everyone sort of reads about. It's one of the classical texts. The city hasn't had a master plan since 1965. This it doesn't work. We cannot plan for 10 or 15. I'm not critiquing the idea of master plans. What I'm pointing out that planning does not work very well when we are trying to define and control. Planning works very well when we are trying to anticipate and adapt. It works at the level of individuals, households, societies. Humans have, according to this perspective, humans have planned their way over the last 1,000 of years. Humans have been around for almost 200,000 years, walking on 2 feet. And from the woods to here, plans have played a fundamental role in helping us anticipate what might happen and how we might need to adapt to that unfolding situation. Another view, which sort of is informed deeply by an anthropological framework, that all plans are ultimately cultural artifacts shaped by human beings, reflect the priorities of the actors that collectively make these plans. So if you sort of look at 1950s or 1960s master plans in India, we know they reflect what people in the Nehruvian planning tradition anticipated might happen, right? So these are ultimately cultural artifacts and should be examined within the context of the place. This is a very interesting insight for democratic societies, that it's very rare that a singular plan acts by itself and shapes the places. It's a constellation of plans. plans made by different people, different organizations. So in case of NCR, think plans made by the NCR Planning Board, plans made by different states, cities, private actors, and they together, they are important because they help negotiate political and social differences. So they are a device where people can talk, say, I want this, no, I want this, and she wants that. And we can negotiate, and sort of the interplay of these plans begin to shape the cities and their region over time, so rather than a singular plan, unless you are in China, of course. So this is important, or Napoleonic Paris, if I might add, right? That would be where one singular plan tries to adapt it. NCR is an interesting case for several reasons. It's one, it is sort of the prototypical model. The plans made in NCR have since independence served as the prototypical model for other Indian cities and regions. The first master plan, remember 1956, was made in Delhi, and it had a regional framework within which planners were thinking. So, and NCR has a very lively tradition of regional scale planning. That was one reason to choose it. The second was NCR is also unique. On one hand, it is sort of prototypical. On the other hand, it's unique that it's 3 states working together. And the plan is mandated, so it is the Parliament of India sort of mandates the 3 states and the center working together. It's a unique case of its own kind, and with many cities in between. It's quintessential rural-urban area, both sort of existing side by side. This is a quick overview, the 4 states and the NCT of Delhi, where I sort of started looking at plans from late 1990s. This was the time when I was in graduate school, when I was planning to go to graduate school, and I found NCR as a very fascinating part of India, where I find now, in the last 15 years, that there are 4 main kinds of plan-making activity going on. It's not one plan, but 4 very different kinds, and I want to talk about them. The first one is state-sponsored plans at various spatial scales. And state plans are both mandated and non-mandated. Mandated are those that are where the legislature or where the government asks that these plans be made and updated regularly. So master plans are a classical example of mandated plans. The critique of mandated plans is that planners have little incentive but to fulfill a legislative mandate to make that plan. So we are doing it because we are required to do it, rather than because we need to do it to shape cities. I find that all the state mandated plans and non-mandated plans both have increased since 1990s. This is a slide that sort of shows the regional plan for NCR made by NCRPB. Then the 3 states have made their sub-regional plans in last few years. And within that, we sort of have now, we know that there were master plans for cities, but there are also now master plans at the scale of several cities together. So at urban complex and greater Bhiwadi and so on and so forth. So this is a hierarchy of state-sponsored plans that is beginning to emerge. There's not much literature on it, but this I find very interesting, that they are now state-sponsored mandated plans at various spatial scales that have begun to emerge. The non-mandated plans are more interesting. They are the government and various departments and agencies are not required to make it, but think of, for example, the plans made by Forest Department. It's not a mandated plan, though the mandate of state's Forest Department is clear from the legislature. And when they make these plans, within the Indian context, they are both sort of seen as stated government policy, and they carry certain legal sanctity. So the Forest Department might never publish their plan, but they have a plan as to what is a state forest, what's a reserve forest, and so on and so forth. These plans are sort of seen as having legal standing. And thus they are frequently challenged in courts, both if the state fails to meet what the plan envisaged, or if that plan is contravened, either by the state itself or other actors. Now this, in a democratic process, sort of creates all sort of problems. In this respect, they are non-indisputable instruments of an all-powerful development state, like the one envisaged by Nehruvian planners, right? So these plans are one, they are not the foremost, or they are not the leading plans. So they are extremely important. They have legal standing backed by state sanction, but they are not the only players. They are frequently impeded by others. Now, there are both existing agencies and new agencies that are helping the spread and scope of state plans in explicit and implicit ways. Explicit, we know. DDA publishes a new master plan. It explicitly affects what's happening in this area. But implicitly, I think, is more important. For example, plans made for roads. Planners are aware of this. Master plans, at most, can sort of shape the land use within the urban boundary. But a road has much longer. If we make a road through an area, it has a much larger impact on land use and other patterns over time. Now, these are perhaps not seen as plans, but these are state-sponsored plans, non-mandated, right? So you might not think of road plans made by PWD as plans. But these are plans with much larger implicit impact over a period of time. Sectoral plans, these plans, folks used to talk about, economists, essentially in 60s, 70s, and 80s. We now talk much less about sectoral plans, but they are playing increasing important roles. They're usually centered around the initiative of state agencies and departments in a particular sector of the economy. They may neither be mandated nor published formally. For example, plan for the steel sector, you might find some references within a 5-year plan. But they often operate as the hidden hand of the developmentalist state. So think telecom. The telecom ministry does not have a plan per se, formally published, but they have a plan hidden in their documents. And that shapes how the telecom geography of this country changed over the last 20 years, with huge implication for the manner in which urban regions are organized and shaped and governed and evolve over time. They're usually conceived in a very piecemeal and disjointed manner as you go along from yearly budget to budget, and ideas about downstream and upstream players. I sort of see this example as a good one in times to come, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. This is sort of a sectoral plan, industrial activity essentially, but sort of brings together transportation players, logistics, freight, warehousing, downstream activities, industrial activities all together, along with the building of new townships and so forth. And these sort of operationalize the new modes of development in this country, like public-private partnerships, invites private sector to come into the planning activity. This sort of zooms in and shows the kind of region it would eventually implement as it goes along. Now, these sectoral plans are also the one which sort of enable the liberal development-oriented rural areas, right? So education would be a great example of sectoral planning, or health, provision of health infrastructure in remote and secluded areas of the country. The third, which have gained the maximum traction in the literature in the last few years, is what I call project plans. They are usually, they target specific development works. You see many of these in NCR. And they are interesting in the sense that for the first time, they sort of also take place beyond urban boundaries. So people can route their project plans through gram panchayats. If I want to make a large development project, let's say gated community in what's called Greater Gurgaon, right? So you can imagine a rural village, and you reroute it through gram panchayat. So project plans have increased in frequency. Here's one which sort of comes, this graphic comes out of Rajasthan sub-area regional plan. State sort of promotes this kind of development. It's here related with tourism, but also by private developers. This is JP in Noida and many others. It's not only the private sector which is making project plans, it's also the public sector. So think of many central universities, think of many new institutions, health centers promoted by different state agencies. So project plan is sort of the third kind of planning, this is happening. The fourth one is perhaps a very Indian characteristic of planning, the informal, the tacit, the unforeseen, and spontaneous plans. I sort of see it very closely related with small p plans, where people who, and this is sort of a very well-established critique of Nehruvian planning model, that formal planning frameworks in this country do not provide much space for other kinds of plan, right? So they are illegal or extra legal right off the bat by default if you are making a plan that does not have space. And the formal planning frameworks, as I said, provide very little space for other kinds of plans. And thus they are susceptible to punitive actions. If you try to make your own personal plan and you sort of try to make that extra room on top of your garage, somebody would show up and demolish it, right? So it is, second, it's variety of reasons, like political patronage, very little state reach on the state, reach on the ground, things like inadequate government capacity, things like lack of end-use supervision, right? We can think of many factors. These plans continue to proliferate. So in my 10 months of field work across the region, I find informal plans, and they are usually tacit. They very incrementally and gradually accumulate over a period of time, from smallest settlement to central cities. And they sort of find shelter within this larger notion, if you interview state officials and planners, that these are impossible to wish away. They can demolish now only very strategically, or only at places where it is a must. And that too the time has to be chosen rightly, the political decision making has to take place at a certain time. So these proliferate tacitly. And it is the interplay of these four kinds of plans that is beginning to shape, right? Is one more important or more significant than others? I do not think so. I think all four, and these are four broad kinds, we can think of many sub-kinds within each, are beginning to shape. So from a very well-established and well-theorized Nehruvian planning model, we have sort of moved into this terrain where there is a multiplicity of plans. If we think of plans broadly in a Catholic manner with a large C, right, not with a small C. So with the capitalistic C Catholic kind of planning, there's a multitude of factors that are making that plans and shaping. Neither this is well theorized, and unless it's well theorized, policymakers would not be able to understand what's going on. So that's sort of the terrain we have moved into last few decades. So in order to summarize, let's do a few quick points here. We are going, and this is my claim here, we are undergoing largely invisible yet salient changes. These are substantial changes, including the emergence of different kind of plans, perhaps best evident at the regional scale. If you look in smaller settlements, you need a substantial geography to sort of begin to make sense of these broad patterns that are beginning to emerge. Plan making definitely is moving away from a state-centered approach and towards a multiplicity of urban actors, closely tied, very closely tied with larger shifts in the polity, right? Plans essentially are made by the host society. They are not being made by outsiders. So they are largely in consonance with the social and economic and political changes that are taking place in the country. Thank you. And questions. Over to you, Christine.